Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Justice Committee on Policing's 8th meeting of 2020. We have apologies from Liam MacArthur and Fulton McGregor, who are both attending other parliamentary meetings. Agenda 1 is a decision to take item 3 in private, which is a review of the evidence we'll hear today. Are we all agreed? A note agreement. Thank you very much indeed for that. Our next agenda item is an evidence session on the requirements for the police budget for 2021-22. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And I welcome our panel of witnesses today. We have Mr. James Gray, Chief Financial Officer, and Mr. David Page, Deputy Chief Officer from Police Scotland, and our talented technical staff are working very hard to ensure that at some point Lynn Brown, Interim Chief Executive of the Scottish Police Authority, is able to join us. And hopefully that will be the case. Now, I thank the witnesses for providing written evidence, which is most helpful for the subcommittee, and also for accommodating the change of time for today's meeting, which has also meant that some of our members have been unable to attend. Can I just, before we start questions, and I'll do the first question, can I remind members it would be helpful to the broadcasting team if they would indicate in advance of asking their question who they're going to direct it to in the first instance, please. And if I start with the first question, and this will be to Mr. Page. I wonder if you're able to outline if that Police Scotland have had any preliminary discussions with the Scottish Government with regard to this year's draft budget, and if so, what representations you have made, and indeed how these representations were received, please. Mr. Page.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, we've worked closely with the Scottish Government and providing them with very early sight of what our budget requirements are, what the progress of our budget management is. We work with officials through the Policing Division and through the Finance Division. We also speaking and we'll be having a meeting with the Justice and the Finance Secretary later this month to lay out what the requirements are, both for policing from a kind of annual budget perspective, but also to discuss long-term financial sustainability for Police Scotland and how we can address the structural deficit in policing. So we have good engagement.
Thank you very much indeed. Indeed, other members will touch on these questions, and it would be good to hear from the SPA in relation to that one I've just posed there. And I understand that efforts are continuing to have Ms. Brown join us. I wonder, and to Mr. Gray perhaps, the COVID-19 outbreak and the associated economic fallout has and will continue to have significant impact on public finances. How concerned are you that any expectations you may have for this year's draft budget will certainly not be able to be met? Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Convener. So we have already done an initial assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on our budget for this financial year. One of the biggest impacts has been a reduced level of income as a result of policing less events and less sporting type events. So that has had an £8 million impact on the budget, and we would expect that to continue into 21-22, that there will be some residual impact around, airport passenger numbers and the number of events that are held, so that there is a risk around that. We've also seen additional costs in relation to PPE, which have been quite significant, and in total for this financial year, we're expecting an overall pressure on the budget of over £7 million, in addition to £8 million of lost income, which had already been built into the budget in March. So when you take those two together, then the impact on the policing budget in the current financial year has been £15 million. And as I say, I would expect some impact to continue into 21-22, which will also contribute to the difficulties in trying to find a a suitable budget to be set next March. So I am concerned around the additional costs that we've been incurring, the costs that will carry on into next year, and the general pressure on public finances, both across the UK and within Scotland, and how that may make the settlement for 21-22 more challenging than it would otherwise have been had we not have had this pandemic.
Thank you for that, Mr. Bray. You touched on the issue of PPP. Can I ask you, and I accept that you're here to discuss next year's budget, but you'll be aware of correspondence that the Scottish Police Federation have shared with the committee. Can I ask you the extent, if at all, to which the provision of PPE for staff has been tempered by budgetary restraints?
Yes, Convener, absolutely happy to take that question. There have been no financial constraints put on the purchase of PPE. There has been no delay being made in the purchase of PPE. We followed the Scottish Government guidelines around homologation and retrospective approval, so we haven't, governance hasn't held up decision making around purchasing, and the budget, to be honest, was not a consideration in the early days. The focus was on making sure the officers and staff had the PPE that they needed. Now, it wasn't without challenge because of issues around availability and supply chains, orders that were falling through, and just the difficulty in trying to secure PPE, but it was not in any way linked to financial constraints. The only financial consideration that I had been pushing on PPE was, as soon as we had got into a bit of a rhythm, and notwithstanding it's been a dynamic situation and has changed, was to try and quantify the actual run rate of PPE so that we were better able to reorder PPE in time for it before it ran out, and also that we didn't get into a situation where we ended up with too much PPE. So there's been some general management about making sure that we haven't been just ordering without knowing what quantities are. But in the first couple of months when we didn't know how much we were going to be using, that there was no financial constraints put on the PPE budget at all, and there has been no financial constraint put on since then. The only financial, as I say, the only financial intervention has been to make sure that we're now trying to establish proper controls around run rates and distribution and such like.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. McGrath. And I see your colleague, Mr. Page, wants to come in on this, and I'll let him in. It's just to advise members that we have been joined by Ms. Brown, and I'll perhaps revisit that first question with her. Mr. Page, do you want to comment on this? And perhaps can you comment on the suggestion that there's one mask and that's it per officer, please?
Thanks, Convener. I mean, just to reiterate Mr. Gray's points, at the very start of the pandemic, guidance and the direction, which was the health and safety of our officers was absolutely paramount, and that we were to do everything we could to ensure that their health and safety, and that included both having the right guidance from our health and safety people, Public Health Scotland, and the Health and Safety Executive. So we very much use those as a platform for defining the requirement. As Mr. Gray said, there was no budget constraints at all placed on this. And the second thing we did was to ensure that we didn't work in isolation of partners. So my procurement teams worked very closely with NHS, Scottish Government and the NPCC. So it was a quick coordinated approach, because obviously the biggest challenge wasn't about financing, the biggest challenge was about the supply, because everyone was looking for it. In terms of one mask per officer, every single officer is provided with PPE. There is no consideration of one and done. They have a mask. If they use it, we'll provide them with another mask. We built supplies in. This is the point that Mr. Gray was referencing, which is the run rate. So to ensure that our stores have sufficient supplies of PPE equipment so it can be refreshed. Have we had issues with that supply chain and logistical management? Absolutely, because it was unprecedented. But again, there was no constraints around you only get one mask or you only get one of anything. It was always about, let's make sure everyone's got what they need, and then let's make sure we've got enough available for everyone to resupply. The system's not perfect because it's obviously an incredibly challenging time, but there was no constraints, and it was always about use your equipment and we'll make sure we get you some resupply.
Thank you. That's helpful to hear. This is a meeting about budget, so we'll not go into the operational aspects at this time. Thank you very much. Ms. Brown, welcome. I don't know if we're going to see you. I understand we'll certainly hear you. And I don't know if you were able to hear the first two questions I posed. Were you able to hear them, Ms. Brown?
I came in at the end of the first question, Convener. First of all, apologies for my being late. I had some technical difficulties, which my colleagues at the Scottish Parliament were very, very adept at sorting out, but my apologies for coming late. So if you wouldn't mind, Convener, repeating the first question, the first two questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yes, indeed. I think you've been a bit hard on yourself. I know you were trying to get in long before the meeting started. So thanks for joining us. The question was just about any preliminary discussions that the SPA may have had with the Scottish Government with regard to this coming year's draft budget, what specific representations were made and how these representations were received. And the second question was about whether any expectations you have will not be able to be met as a result of the COVID outbreak.
Thank you, Convener. Maybe start with your first question in terms of representations. In our submission, we make clear that the issues going into 21-22 are not new. They're not dependent on COVID-19, and there's been an ongoing debate around them for a while with our colleagues in the Scottish Government. So they're well aware of the issues, and in fact, because of being aware of those issues, they were able to approve our deficit budget for 2021 because they understood the structured deficit and the reasons behind it. In terms of liaison and discussion with the Scottish Government, it is ongoing. Every issue quite often has a resources implication, and our policy in governance terms is that there are no surprises, that they understand the issues and they understand the decisions that might be made. So there's ongoing consultation on resources constantly. I think Mr. Page referred to a meeting that's going to be held in a couple of weeks between the Cabinet Secretaries of Finance and Justice, of which the SPA will attend, as well as the Chief Constable and Police Scotland. And again, that is to build on those conversations and dialogue that has been there before, so they can understand the financial sustainability going forward. I think if I may turn to your second question, please, Convener, which was to do with, I think you're asking about the impact on public sector and the COVID and the possibility of our budget being met, I think was your question. So on that, Convener, thank you, Convener. So on that, I mean, we're acutely aware as a public body and have governance around the Resources Committee and the board on the issues that are impacting on Police Scotland and Forensic Services and ourselves in relation to COVID-19. So we're acutely aware of our own, but we know that we won't be alone in that. Other public organisations will be going through the same challenges, particularly those who have got real income streams. We've got a relatively small income stream that isn't covered by grant, but other public sector organisations will. So I think there are really hard choices for ministers going forward, and that meeting that's just been referred to, I think, is part of the ministers getting an understanding of the issues. There will be difficult choices between competing public sector demands, and it's very important, therefore, that we give the evidence to support our bid into those resources. But we don't underestimate the difficulties that 21-22 will face the public sector.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Our next questions are from Shona Robertson. Shona, please.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to, first of all, return to James Gray, who started to touch on this in answer to John Finney's question, and it's to go into a little bit more detail around the impact of COVID-19 and other major events on the budget going forward. You touched on how difficult it's going to be for 21-22, but is there any more detail you can give us on the impact of these events on resources, or is that work really being gone through at the moment, or can you give us more detail?
Thank you for your question. The impact on our income budget has been quite wide-ranging, and obviously, we are working on a set of assumptions as to what the impact will be between now and the 31st of March for the remainder of this financial year, and then obviously starting to plan for next year, which is more complicated, just given we'll not know where we'll be. So, you know, the return of fans to sporting events, the startup of you know, concerts and events, the timing of those, and you know, we made assumptions in March, which we thought were quite severe. We forecast a 20% reduction in income, and that turned out to be understating it as we went through the summer and saw that, you know, that the actual impact of lockdown and the knock-on impact is for events that continues to be an issue and will be for months to come. So, you know, we're looking at it's football matches, music events, other big events. Airport income is significant to us. It's worth over £5 million, and given that the footfall in you know, passenger numbers into the main airports has been so low, we have, with agreement with the Scottish Government, reduced those charges in the current year, you know, to reflect the fact that Edinburgh Airport, for example, in April would expect to have had, I think, 1.2 or 1.3 million passengers and had 5,000 go through. So, you know, there's that. And then looking forward to next year, with the knock-on impact onto other public bodies, as was mentioned earlier, then the income that we rely upon from local authorities and other public sector bodies, which has been decreasing over a number of years and has already decreased by £11 million, we would anticipate that may accelerate into 21-22 as other public sector bodies have to you know, pull back to their core activity. So it's hard to actually quantify what that impact might be at the moment on next year's income budget, but it will be significant, and it's work that is underway that we're updating on a monthly basis as more information becomes available.
It might be helpful, Mr. Gray, if once that information begins to crystallise, I certainly hadn't really thought of the income loss, but it's an obvious one, particularly from the airports. So it would be helpful maybe to get a little bit more detail in writing, if you have that at the moment, about those income streams and what they would normally generate and what they're likely to generate in the current climate. I think that'd be helpful for the committee to understand. My other question is about the scope to make reductions to non-pay costs, which is always in every budget where there's pressure, given that most of the budget is on pay. Do you think Police Scotland have reached the limit of what can be achieved with non-pay costs, or is that something that you still think it has got potential?
So, in relation to your first point, I will undertake to write to members of the committee, happy to do so, to provide income information on our projections into next year and a kind of breakdown of where those areas are. So I'll do that. On your main question on non-pay, the non-pay budget has been reduced by over £80 million since the start of Police Scotland. So it's already seen significant reductions, which, you know, would have been anticipated as a result of merging organisations together, cutting out elements of duplication, and getting better purchasing power through you know, a larger organisation. But what we found when we set the budget in this current financial year, where we took a zero-based approach, so a kind of bottom-up build of our non-pay budget, we found that actually we had underprovided into non-pay, which was the suspicion that we had, but we wanted a proper evidence base to demonstrate it and to share that with colleagues in SG Finance and SG Police Division, so that they fully understood it. And what that resulted in was actually us increasing the non-pay budget for 2021, and it's to address the issues such as maintenance of the estate, which is something that has come up in the past and indeed is included in the Federation submission, and making sure that officers are properly equipped to do the job. We've highlighted in our written submission, the one from Police Scotland, that the non-pay budget within policing is 14% in Scotland compared to an average of 22% across the UK. Now, it's not it's hard to draw comparisons because of different operating models, but we are an outlier in the UK in how much of the budget goes on non-pay. So I really think that the 85 million or so that has been taken out to date is at the maximum based on my experience of the kind of risk assessment outcomes of where we had got to in 1920 by continually reducing non-pay budgets, and that, as I say, that bottom-up build in the current financial year that gave an evidence base to suggest that the non-pay budget is tight. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you. That's me, convener.
Thank you, Shona. Our next questions are from Rona Mackay. Rona, please.
Thank you, convener, and good morning, panel. Just following on from my colleagues' questions there, if I could come to Mr. Gray first. Approximately 85% of the entire police budget is spent on workforce costs. And this is a proportion that's been rising and not falling for the last number of years. Can I ask if you think that's a sustainable position given the challenges that Police Scotland are facing now and in the future? And if it's not sustainable, how would you address it?
Good morning, and thank you for your question. I think the question you raise is absolutely right, and it's linked to the previous one in that it's effectively the balance between the pay costs and the non-pay costs, and the non-pay costs have been reducing over time in order to sustain the workforce numbers. So I think your observation is correct, or what I took from it was that no, it's not sustainable to continue in that trend of continually squeezing the non-pay in order to sustain the pay budget. So that there are a number of options or a combination of options that are required fundamentally to address the sustainability issue. And on one side you've got continuing with a deficit, which actually is not a satisfactory way to continue in my view. Setting a deficit budget every year has a destabilizing effect on the organisation, and is a pressure that we would rather not be having to deal with on a even down to the cash flow management situation on a month-to-month basis. So the other alternatives are to address it through increased levels of government funding, or to look at the size of the workforce and through workforce planning agree an approach to reduce that workforce. I say that with a caveat, which is that the Chief Constable has, and it's in the written submission, in his view, looking ahead operationally over the next 12 to 18 months with the continuation of COVID-19, Brexit and the implications of that, and the COP26 conference that's scheduled for November 2021, that this would not be the time to reduce police officer numbers. But from a purely financial perspective, then workforce reductions, which the biggest part of our police officers, would have to be a consideration for bringing the budget back into line, and indeed had been a key part of the 2017 financial plan, which was to reduce police officer numbers by 750 to this financial year, which if had that have been done, we would have had a balanced budget in the current year. So in summary, it's a combination of workforce size and potential reductions there, increases in funding, or a continuation of a deficit, or a combination of those three.
Rona, can I bring Mr. Page in at this point, please?
Yeah, I was just going to, Mr. Page, could I have your view, please, on that?
Thank you for the question. Just to build on what Mr. de Grey said, fundamentals are exactly as you said, which is it's the workforce, it's the funding available, and it's the deficit. The other dimension is investment. We've been asking for some time for a considerable injection of capital investment to support the transformation of Police Scotland. And what we can do with investment, as we've now shown through things like the Livability Project, through the contact assessment model, is if we improve our systems and our processes, utilising technology, we can actually increase the capacity of Police Scotland. to deliver the services it can. And if we get that investment, that actually reduces the requirement for the workforce to be the size it is. Adjust the workforce alongside the digital capability of the organisation to function. Having said that, there is a reality of policing, which is the Chief Constable's point, which is under certain scenarios, you just need bodies. You need police officers to go out and to intervene and force. And COP26, Brexit, the European football, depending on what happens with that, with COVID-19, that pandemic, there is a requirement for the physical presence of police officers to be on the ground. You can't get away from that, no matter how much technology you put in play. But if you're looking at long-term sustainability of Police Scotland, then it has to be off the back of an appropriate level of investment, both into Police Scotland to help us make an efficient model, but also into the broader justice sector, because obviously we're part of the system. So with investment into Police Scotland, then we can, as we're doing in other areas, we can help the broader system be more efficient, and that will improve service across multiple areas and reduce costs. So there is a system component to this, and there is an investment component to it. I just want to kind of add that to the considerations that with additional investment we can become more efficient.
So thank you. If I'm understanding correctly, what you're saying is that workforce reduction would be an absolute last resort, but it may have to come into play, and if you could boost some technical investment, that might be the case. And if that is the case, can you give us an idea about what numbers you're talking about? How many people would you have to lose? Mr. Page, can you answer that?
Going forwards, can't see if I'm talking or not at the moment.
I think we've lost you.
Rona, I think, Mr. Page, are you once more active? Are you able to answer that? And then we'll hear from Mr. Gray. If you could answer, Rona, please. Yes, indeed.
Okay, shall I continue?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. I wouldn't say workforce reduction is the last thing that we would look to do. What we've been working on doing is getting the right size of the workforce, and we should move to the right size of workforce as quickly as we can. And the strategic workforce plan is the underlying platform for determining that. The right size workforce is a combination of what the demand is on policing, what the expectations of the public and the government are, and what the role of policing is, how efficient we can be, which is where the technology investment comes in, and also what the political appetite is. We have argued for some considerable time that it should be the effect of policing, the policing capability that should be the measure of the level of investment required in policing. But as we widely recognise, police officer numbers tends to be the headline, with been happening in England and Wales with the additional 20,000 officers, with the additional 1,000 officers that came into Police Scotland section. That's become a sort of bellwether number. We had tried to move away from that in terms of productivity and the capacity of the organisation to work. So we don't have we're not trying to protect a given number. What we're trying to do is make sure that the number we have and the right mixture of police officers and staff for technology and the right demand data will allow Police Scotland to police our communities in the way that they can be most efficiently policed, but also recognising that the ability for mass mobilisation of police officers to intervene in things like public order issues with COP26 or with Brexit, or in the kind of very much of the protecting the public health around COVID, you need people on the ground. So there has to be a recognition that you're never going to get to a point where technology supplements an officer on the street who's actually intervening in a physical issue where we need bodies on the ground. So there is no, we don't want to reduce the workforce. What we do want to do is reduce the workforce to the right mix and the right size, supported by technology to do the job that we're asked to do.
Could I possibly ask Ms Brown what her view on workforce reduction is, if the police authority have a view on that?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, the authority's position is that in the absence of the strategic workforce plan that has been worked on and that has to be underpinned by real evidence around demand and productivity, the authority can't really currently say what the right workforce mix is or what the right number is. We are looking at seeing that information so we can form a view, and is being worked on. But for us, until that's in place, we can't say what the right number for the police force will be.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Rona. Mr. Gray, you wished in at this point.
Yes, thank you, Convener, for letting me come back in. It was just on a point of completeness around non-pay costs when I answered that there wasn't any scope based on the bottom-up build. That is based on our current operating model. But picking up on Mr. Page's point, we are seeking investment into the estates transformation plan and into the decarbonisation of the fleet by moving to electric vehicles. That there are some saving opportunities there. Between the two of them, potentially £10 million, but over the medium term, that they're not immediately available. But it goes back to the point that if the investment would be forthcoming into somewhere like Fleet, where a move to electric vehicles is cheaper running costs, and that you don't have the fuel, electricity is cheaper than the fuel, and because there's less moving parts in electric vehicles, the maintenance is significantly lower. So that if we could change the operating model through investment in non-pay, there is some further opportunity for savings, albeit it wouldn't be such that it would be able to address the current deficit position.
Okay, Mr. Gray, thank you for that clarification. Our next questions are from James Kelly. James, please.
Thank you, Convener. The kind of main themes so far this morning have concentrated on the size of the pay budget compared to the non-pay costs in the budget, so what I'd like to ask Mr. Page is, bearing in mind that's got a big impact on the workforce, and we've also had some discussion around size and the composition of the workforce. What discussions have taken place with the trade unions and staff associations about these issues?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for that question. When I joined 4 years ago, we set out a policy, and I did it within a couple of weeks. I met with union leaders to be very transparent about both the challenges that Police Scotland were facing and about what our objectives were in terms of the direction in which we wanted to take Police Scotland in terms of transforming the organisation corporately to truly deliver the benefits of police reform on the kind of the organisational and financial running of the organisation. That was a very clear objective. As part of that engagement at the very beginning, commitment that we would engage fully about what our objectives were and how we would go about doing that. Since then, we've every single year we've looked to improve the level of engagement with the union. So and other police federation asks. We invite them now to my corporate finance board every month, the change board every month. We engage them in planning sessions. I run a quarterly capital investment group, which looks at, with the investment we do have available, choices about where we put that investment, because obviously Federation colleagues, AST, Unison, Unite, all have really good input from their members where Police Scotland should put its investment to transform the workforce and transform our capabilities for service. The key challenge for us there, of course, is we do not have enough investment to make everybody happy, which is the case everywhere. But what we do make sure is that they are involved in those discussions before any decisions, and then we explain why we've made the decisions we have. Then we're transparent about what's happening, the progress, the investment, the benefits we seek to get. So we try as far as we can to make sure that they help us on that journey. It's not done to them, it's done alongside them. They have to shape the journey. And hopefully, both Federation Est and our union colleagues would feel that their level of engagement now is considerably better than it was 3-4 years ago.
Thank you, Mr. Page. You've touched on the level of engagement, which is obviously welcome, but can I just push you a bit further in terms of the issues that we're identifying around this budget round, the proportion of the pay budget against the non-pay budget, and how the workforce, I think you acknowledged yourself that you were looking to get the correct workforce figure and the correct composition of the workforce. So clearly these are big challenges. Has there been specific engagement with the staff representatives and the unions on these particular issues in relation to this budget round?
Yes, in the sense of as we go through this financial year, there's a number of restructuring and transformation opportunities could result in redundancies. We consult with union colleagues about what we're doing, why we're doing it, what the intended outcome is, and we go through fully with them that process. In terms of the engagement with them for the following year, for next year, if you like, just in setting the budget, we do need to be very transparent about what it is we're trying to do. So we do engage with them as fully as we can with the best information we have available at the current time. One of the key things, which is a challenge for us, of course, is we are operating a very, very significant deficit, and we don't get the levels of investment that to make some of the technology changes. So quite often, we're talking theoretically about what we could be doing if we had the funding, and that's the conversation we have with Feds, ASP and union colleagues. And then towards the back end of a year, we get told how much we've got, and then we have to cut the plans. So it tends to be a last-minute debate, really, to try and get an agreement around what we're going to do for the budget that we set for that year. One of the things that would be very helpful would be multi-year settlements, because obviously if we move towards multi-year settlements, then we can have a much more meaningful conversation with colleagues both within the force, with the SBA, and with other key stakeholders like the Federation and the unions about the actual plan, as opposed like a strategic plan for improving policing, as opposed to this is what we'd like to do next year if we get the money. We didn't get that much money. This is what we're going to have to do, which tends to be the case at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Page. I think the notion you're putting forward about multi-year settlements is an interesting one, which is certainly worth exploring. Can I just come to Lynn Brown then? In terms of the SPA, you've stated that there's an expectation that the Scottish Government's public sector pay policy should be followed. Is it the SPA's view that there should be some flexibility to allow variance from that, or are you content to follow the strictures of the public sector pay policy?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for that question. And I'd like to clarify what our comment was trying to convey in our submission, which is that we recognise the public sector pay policy is there, that is actually very helpful in terms of planning and negotiation with unions. The difficulty sometimes that has happened for us is where we apply the public sector pay policy, but there's not a financial settlement that comes in behind to support that. So that was just setting out the parameters and some of the constraints that we have to work with, but no way suggests that we do not follow the public sector pay policy or.
Okay, thank you for that. So clearly your view is that you support the public sector pay policy, but you're looking for a financial arrangement in the budget that allows the organisation to follow through with that public sector pay policy and deliver it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. Absolutely.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. That concludes my questions, convener. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Our next set of questions are from the Deputy Convener, Margaret Mitchell. Margaret, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. The refreshed joint strategy for Policing 2020, Policing for a Safe, Protected and Resilient Scotland, seeks to deliver a sustainable, modern and flexible police service. The strategy is supported, however, by plans to transform and improve technology, fleet and the building estate. Can you spell out the extent to which this objective is compromised, given Police Scotland made the case for capital funding of £246.8 million, and instead there's a shortfall of 45% in this capital budget allocation by the Scottish Government? And Mr Page, that's to you first, and then Ms Brown.
Excuse me. Thank you for the question. We've laid out very clear plans, as you say, for our technology estates and both strategies and the plans. Clearly, not getting the capital and the investment that we require slows down our ability to implement those plans. Having said that, we do continue to make progress on all three of those fronts. Especially around the States and fleet, where we've shifted the strategies to be one of a much more collaborative approach with partners on the fleet, where we're trying to lead on the electrification and decarbonisation of the fleet. But the reason for that is it's consistent with Scottish Government policy UK. It's actually better for the environment genuinely. It's actually it's cheaper to run those types of fleets in the long run. And to be fair, and we're very grateful for the support that Transport Scotland has provided over and above our normal budget in terms of assisting Police Scotland in progressing with our push into that kind of green space. The technology side of it, there isn't much more we could do if we had more money, there's no doubt about it. But we do, we are improvement as we can. The big challenge about not getting the level of investment we require, especially around the technology plans, is because technology shifts and moves so quickly. As I published the DDICT strategy a couple of years ago now, because the level of investment was principally geared around a 3 to 4 year profile of investment. Because we're running at a much slower pace, it means the profile of technology availability changes quite considerably. So that does have an effect on those plans, because it means we may not be using the same type of technology, or there might be different types of challenges. So at the point of laying strategies, laying the plans with a clear investment profile to support them, the benefits and the outcomes that we say at that point are the ones we can reasonably achieve. If the investment, as you say, is running at 45% of what we're asking for, it slows the process down. It just means it's longer for us to deliver, and also it will change the running costs, because with those delays comes increase in costs and an increase in delay of the outcome delivery.
I'll come back to more specifically about each of these sections that you've mentioned, fleet, estate and technology, but perhaps, Ms Brown, I could get your reaction to what is quite a worrying slowing down of the strategy for 2020 because of this lack of funding.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. The authority continues to make a compelling case alongside Police Scotland for more continuing capital, but we also recognise that has to be based on sound strategies, and they have been considered, brought to the board by Police Scotland, and as you say, Deputy Convener, dates, IT and fleet, and we seek to have opportunities where we can. So Mr Page has already touched on the green agenda for fleet, which we are progressing along with Transport Scotland, with Scottish Government colleagues. So we realise that there are constraints. We will continue to make a case to have a share of the resources that are available, and we've got sound strategies to support those bids into the Scottish Government.
Since you mentioned fleets specifically, Ms Brown, I wonder if you can give me your view. Police Scotland has ambitions, obviously, as you you've said, to make the fleet greener and become the first UK police service fleet with an ultra-low emission vehicles. However, in the submission from the SPF, they state that the immediate focus on electric vehicles could well be to the detriment of our workhorses. The 365 24/7 vehicles that communities recognise as police cars and which police rely on at present. So how are you ensuring that these priorities are being adequately managed and the fleet is fit for purpose? Ms Brown, and then either Mr Gray, I think, since you mentioned it before.
Okay. Thank you, Deputy Convener. In terms of the SPA's governance around this, they are mindful of the debate and the dialogue around the green fleet as opposed to other types of transport, but they support the Police Scotland when they put forward proposals to access capital expenditure, which at the moment quite often is just geared to the electric fleets. And we would be missing that opportunity to tap into that investment. In terms of the actual details around the fleet and the operational matters, I'd like to ask Mr Page if you would cover that, please. Thank you, Deputy Convener.
Mr Page, is there sufficient money given this investment going in? And I understand why, it's a good objective, but is there sufficient funds to ensure the existing fleet is fit for purpose, given the cost of repairs for an ageing fleet, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mitchell. The fleet strategy did a couple of things. One was it talked about the ambition to move to ULEV, but we could only move at a pace which was appropriate with the availability of the right types of vehicles for policing purposes, and secondly for the infrastructure, thirdly for the funding. Separately to that, part of the fleet strategy was to review and address the way we were running the fleet. So we did make a number of changes to things like the replacement criteria. In the actual strategy, it used to be that we would change vehicles over on a 10-year basis for the unmarked vehicles, and generally it'd be about 5 years and 150,000 miles for the current response vehicles. We've changed that. It's now half of that. And the level of investment that we put into, if you like, the normal fleet, excluding ULEV, has not reduced compared on a year-on-year basis. This year, I think we're putting in about 1.6 million into it. We had actually allocated, I think it was about 3.3 million in total for going into the fleet, but we've actually directed some of that investment into public order vehicles, which needed refreshed, which helps support our preparation for COP26. Could we invest more in the fleet? Absolutely, but our investment criteria in the fleet is constrained by the overall capital settlement, because obviously I can safely say that every single area of the force that puts a demand into me for capital every single year, none of them get what they need. Every single one of them, we have to kind of cut the pie a lot smaller than they look for. The moving to the green fleet hasn't diminished our ability to support the fleet. It's actually enhanced it because of the additional funding that we've been receiving from Scotland. That's been kind of separate to our core settlement. So we are not where we would love to be, we would like to be, but from last year we have improved, and we are improving maintenance on the road availability. We've actually also improved numbers of vehicles that are available across Scotland. So if people need to take their cars in to be repaired, we have a car available for them to go back out on the ground. We were aware at the Federation, it was good conversations with the Federation we had a year, 18 months ago, about the fact that some of the issues we had with was that when cars did start to suffer troubles, because we didn't have enough availability of spare cars so that they would put a car into the garage, then we would give them a replacement. What was happening was officers would try and patch up the vehicles themselves. and that led to photographs of gaffer tape holding wing mirrors together and stuff like that. We've listened to the Federation. We put more investment for this current year into having additional vehicles available to remove that reluctance of officers to put cars into the garage at the earliest stage. Because at that point, if we deal with the problem quite early, the cost of fixing it much cheaper than if they keep it themselves. It eventually comes to us when it's unworkable, if you like. So we continue to improve on normal maintenance. We've reduced the running mileage replacement, and we have got additional investment in green fleet. So I think on the fleet, we're probably addressing most of the, other than the fact that I don't have enough money to do everything what everyone wants. It has been a significant improvement.
So as a short answer, then you can give the SPF the assurance that there will be sufficient funds available to ensure that 365 24/7 vehicles are fit for purpose.
The assurance I can give them is with the capital I've got available for it, I'll do the best I can.
Qualified assurance then. Can I ask you again, Mr. You talked, Mr. Page, you talked about the Mr. Gray, you talked about the estate, and Police Scotland had previously stated that it was concentrating on health and safety issues and effectively putting band-aids on the estate and not addressing its overall condition effectively. Is that still the position? Because we know there were specifics, the ceiling collapsing on Broughty Ferry, other reports of chairs falling apart, being threadbare. I can testify that in Hamilton Police Station, where it looks tired, jaded, and frankly, it doesn't inspire confidence from the general public, and it doesn't appear to me to be a satisfactory working environment for police.
Good morning, Deputy Convener, and thank you for your question. What you said, I absolutely agree with, that we are still in a position where the work that we do is health and safety. It's largely reactive work, dealing with failure. Where we would like to get to is to be proactive and have a proper planned maintenance schedule, meeting the life cycle item replacements, things like roofs and boilers, and do that on a planned basis. As you'll be aware, we had commissioned a condition survey piece of work. It has been delayed because of COVID, but we will we'll get the results of that by the end of this financial year. But based on the feedback that we're getting, we have factored in to the capital table in our submission how much we think the estate would require over the next 5 years in order to try and address some of those issues and get on the front foot, to move away from being reactive, dealing with roofs that fall in, to actually getting them fixed and improving the fabric of the estate as we go forward. So that there is an ask, and it's been put into the infrastructure investment work that Scottish Government has been working on, and into the low carbon fund, an ask of £178.8 million over the next 5 years. Now that would help us get out of this reactive situation that we're in, and it would also enable some of the transformation work, which would allow greater co-location and collaboration opportunities with other public sector partners, would reduce the overall floor requirement, and most importantly, for the well-being of our officers and staff, it would improve the quality of the fabric of the estate, as you mentioned in your experience of Hamilton, and as I see in different police buildings that I go all across the country.
Thank you for that. I wonder, Ms. Brown, if you could comment on that and how much you see that as a priority for SPA to argue for.
Thank you, Deputy Convener, for that question. It's really important for the SPA to have oversight of this whole area, and they do that in a public and accountable way in the first instance, through our Resources Committee, which has the ability to look at the estate strategy, look at the plans to fix the estate's issues, and also gets reports on wellbeing and health and safety. So it's getting a comprehensive picture of the issues. So we are very mindful that it is a live issue, that there are plans to address it, and we keep appropriate oversight of that.
Thank you for that. There's a wish list there, but I think there's a here and now that needs addressed fairly urgently. Finally, Convener, can I ask the SPA about some of the technology, the IT, the investment? There's various contracts awarded in this financial year. Whether the total figure of 150.6 million as set out in the procurement annual report has been updated, and would it be possible to provide details of these contracts which relate specifically to ICT, which is so important in modernising our police force, protecting our police, and making sure it's able to cope with criminals who are always ahead of the game in technology terms. And perhaps Ms Brown, would you want to answer?
Thank you, Deputy Convener. Yes, you referred to the annual procurement report, which was considered by the authority, I think, in June of this year, and it was giving reporting on the spend on all contracts for 1920 in the previous year. That report is very detailed. It sets out the type of expenditure, the value of the contract, and the the time scale of the contract. In that, I think you quoted 150 million, which was the figure, and roughly about a third, I think, was on IT. And although we're happy to confirm that, and in that report it sets out the detail. In terms of where we are at the moment and looking forward, we will report next year. We will have oversight again of the spend for 2021. Again, that level of detail will be there. However, in the meantime, in the report that went in June, we set out quite clearly what we intend to spend on these contracts, and ICT is in there. Again, it sets out the type of contract and the value and the term. And part of that is to have a planned approach to your IT investment, which you're asking about, Deputy Convener, but it's also to ensure we get best value. So potential contractors, potential suppliers can see what's coming and they can bid appropriately. So we have oversight of it, and we plan for that spend.
And either Mr Gray or Mr Page would like to comment on it. Mr Gray? Mr Page, carry on.
Thank you, Deputy Convener. Just as Ms Brown says, we publish all of the reports. I'm very happy to write to the committee and highlighting the technology contracts that we've published for the last year. Very happy to do that.
And your ask for the new financial year?
In terms of the actual capital ask for the new financial year?
What would you like to see happening with that? How can it be helped with in the budget?
A very significant increase, if we can. We have provided the Scottish Government with what our profile of investment is. We asked for 74 million for this year. Our original planning was for about 84 million for next year, which is the year we're coming into. We need to revise that in light of the changes both in terms of the investment we had for this year, which was less than we wanted, changing circumstances. James Gray can probably give a little bit more information about what we've actually advised the SGU about so far in terms of the actual numbers.
Mr Gray?
To take forward DDICT next year, we were looking in the region of £45 million to take that forward, and over a period of 5 years, £169 million. And some of the key components of work within that are to roll out mobile devices to the remainder of the police officers. It's looking to move ahead on some more police systems, and also to take forward the body-worn video work that the force is looking to do. So yeah, it's 45 million next year and 169 million over the next 5 years.
Okay, any additional information that Mr Page referred to would be very helpful. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Margaret. panel time isn't on our side. I have two very quick questions here. The first one I would direct it to yourself, Mr. Page, and I know this has been alluded to in the evidence, but just for the record, the Auditor General, I think you in fact talked about a strategic plan for policing. The Auditor General has been recommending for several years that a workforce plan be developed. Now, I know that there's recent moves on that. Can you tell the committee why it's taken so long to get this matter concluded, if indeed it is concluded?
Yeah, thank you, Convener. It's a good question. Strategic workforce planning is a complex and challenging issue for all organisations. In fact, if you look at policing across the entire UK, no one's actually cracked this as a nut. One of the key drivers for strategic workforce planning is demand data, and we have, as part of the transformation work that we were doing, we developed a demand and productivity unit a couple of years ago. We started to get that set up. We were only able to establish a kind of minimum viable product, if you like, in terms of the amount of investment we're able to kind of allocate for that. And again, that's a good example of one of the constraints of a lack of investment. We can't get the demand data up to the level of quality that we would want to fully inform the strategic workforce plan. Having said that, policing is dynamic, and policing is a very dynamic service. When you look at a changing landscape, there's so many different factors you need to take into account in terms of population growth, changing types of demand. You have to look at the consequences of investment across other public services. There's an effect in terms of into policing, so where Police Scotland are effectively asking or acting as a last line of resort, where we go to calls that perhaps should be handled by other public sector bodies, but we are that last line, so we do that. So we have had some trouble and challenges in terms of pulling in the data that we need, explaining the methodology. The Chief Constable has made it very clear that it's an absolute top priority for us. Where we are now is that in November we will be taking our strategic workforce plan to the SVA, and that will help to inform what the future looks like in terms of the policing service of Scotland and what that means for its budget.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Page. One other quick one, please, topical. HMICS this week published its report on thematic inspection of Police Scotland's training and development, and the inspector finds that Police Scotland is under-investing in training and development of officers and staff. It talked about the people strategy and priorities were made without the means or resources to deliver them. Could you please confirm, and this is something perhaps you'd wish to follow up in writing, whether the implementation of the people strategy had been costed and the spend to date, please?
The people strategy was costed. In terms of the actual spend today, I will write you in terms of what those numbers look like. In terms of the HMICS report in relation to leadership, I think we are looking for the evidence of that because of internally our experience of the quality of leadership and strategic thinking of the command team, and when you take it down to chief supers and supers, if you look at our success rate on the UK chief officer selection committee selection process, we do very, very well, and a big part of that is emotional intelligence and strategic thinking and strategic planning. That's one of the key criteria for chief officers, and our strike rate is incredibly good. So we are a bit surprised at the findings. Would like to follow up with HMICS in terms of the evidence base for the comments that were made, but our experience is probably different to what was reported.
Okay, some might say that's quite a narrow measure, the chief officer criteria.
I just want one measure, Convener, but again, we will reply in full.
And I think it is fair to record that we have had representations made to the committee on this issue previously. But if we hear in the costing, that would be very helpful, Mr. Page. Ms Brown, turning to you, can I just ask your awareness of the SPA's oversight of the implementation of the people strategy, please?
Maybe, yes, thank you, Convener. I'd like to maybe start with the oversight, just to give some clarification around oversight of HMICS recommendations in totality, and then which this refers to. So we have had some really positive dialogue with HMICS over the last few months, and there have been improvements there. For example, at our audit committee this week, we had HMICS presenting our Ready for Awareness, their plan for the year, and they're intending to come back at the year end to do an overall report that they publish as well. So there's a chance for the Audit and Risk and Assurance Committee to ask those questions. And at the same time, we are looking to have more proactive close down of recommendations from the HMICS on a whole range of things. So I just want to reassure you in terms of the recommendations that come from HMICS. We value those. We value their expertise, particularly in operational matters, and we are seeking to make sure implemented. In terms of the people strategy, again, we have got a resources committee, and it receives reports on the people strategy, so therefore can assess, I've already said, they can assess against well-being, health and safety, and they have been looking at how that strategy is being developed. And at the senior level, we have got a succession planning committee that also looks at the chief officer people strategy issues. And we will take this report that has been published by HMICS and seek to see that the recommendations are implemented.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very reassuring. And that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session. Can I thank Ms Brown, Mr Gray and Mr Page for your attendance, not least at the change of time, for your forbearance and indeed members' forbearance with some of the technical issues, which hopefully weren't too apparent to anyone watching in, and very grateful to the technical staff that assisted with that. So I thank witnesses for providing evidence to the subcommittee today, and that concludes the public part of today's meeting. The next meeting of the subcommittee will be on the 8th of October, when we will take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice on the Scottish Government's Police Governance and Accountability Review. In the meantime, any follow-up scrutiny issues will be dealt with by correspondence, which, as ever, will be published on our website. As previously agreed, I will now move the meeting into private session.